30,000 feet above the frigid Atlantic, the intercom crackled with a request that froze the blood of every passenger on board. If there is an experienced military combat pilot on this aircraft, ring your call button immediately. In seat 8A, a single father finally opened his eyes. James Sterling had not slept a full night in 3 years. Not since the monitors flatlined in that sterile, white room at Johns Hopkins Hospital, leaving him with a mountain of medical debt and a terrified 4-year-old daughter who didn't understand why mommy wasn't coming home. Now, sitting in seat 8A of a Boeing 777-300ER on a transatlantic red-eye from New York to London, the exhaustion was finally pulling him under. The low, steady hum of the massive GE-90 engines outside his window was a familiar lullaby. James leaned his head against the cold, vibrating plastic of the cabin wall. Beside him in seat 8B, his daughter, Mia, was deeply engrossed in coloring a picture of a dragon, her small fingers clutching a worn red crayon. She was quiet, remarkably well-behaved, carrying a maturity that broke James's heart because he knew it was born of trauma and loss. They were in the premium economy cabin, a splurge James had justified because they were moving their entire lives. He had recently sold their small house in Virginia, liquidating everything to accept a civilian contract job teaching advanced avionics in the United Kingdom. It was a fresh start, a desperate attempt to outrun the ghosts of his past. He pulled his faded leather jacket tighter around himself. On the right shoulder, barely visible, was the ghost of a removed patch, the emblem of the United States Air Force, 94th Fighter Squadron. In seat 8C, across the armrest from little Mia, sat Victoria Kensington. Victoria did not do premium economy. As the billionaire founder and CEO of Kensington Global Logistics, a supply chain empire that rivaled Maersk in its European operations, she usually flew on her private Gulfstream G650. However, a catastrophic mechanical failure with her jet's landing gear in Teterboro had forced her onto the last commercial flight to Heathrow. She had a morning board meeting in London to finalize a hostile takeover of a rival tech firm, and missing it was not an option. Victoria was visibly rigid, radiating impatience in a perfectly tailored charcoal Tom Ford suit. The scent of her expensive perfume, something sharp and floral, wafted over to James's side of the row. For the first 2 hours of the flight, she had been typing furiously on a sleek Apple iPad Pro, aggressively sipping black coffee and glaring at anyone who dared to walk too loudly down the aisle. She had initially shot a look of pure dread at James when she realized a child was sitting next to her. But Mia had not made a peep. At one point, Mia accidentally dropped her red crayon. It rolled under Victoria's Italian leather loafer. James instinctively reached for it, his eyes heavy and bloodshot. "I'm so sorry, ma'am," he mumbled, his voice gravelly from fatigue. Victoria looked down at the man. She noticed the dark, heavy bags under his eyes. She noticed the calluses on his hands, the cheap Casio watch on his wrist, and the way he instinctively shielded the girl with his arm. Then, her eyes flicked to the faint outline of the shield on his jacket. "It's fine," Victoria said, her tone clipped but surprisingly devoid of its usual venom. She picked up the crayon herself and handed it back to Mia. "Keep it on the tray, little one." "Thank you," Mia whispered, flashing a gap-toothed smile. Victoria didn't smile back, but the tightness in her jaw relaxed a fraction. She returned to her glowing screen, reviewing complex financial spreadsheets that dictated the fate of thousands of employees. Yet, her concentration was broken. She kept side-eyeing the father and daughter. There was an undeniable aura of quiet, desperate endurance about the man. He wasn't like the sycophants and corporate sharks she dealt with daily. He looked like a man who had fought a war, survived, but lost something vital in the process. "Get some sleep, Daddy," Mia whispered softly, patting James's arm. "I'll watch the dragon." James managed a weak, heartbreaking smile. "Okay, Bug. Wake me if you need to use the restroom." He closed his eyes. Within minutes, the sheer, crushing weight of single parenthood, grief, and the physical toll of packing a house single-handedly dragged him into a deep, dreamless void. For the first time in weeks, James Sterling was completely, blissfully unconscious. Around them, the cabin lights dimmed to a soft, artificial blue. The flight attendants retreated to their galleys. Outside, the aircraft plunged deeper into the pitch-black abyss of the night sky, flying thousands of miles over the unforgiving expanse of the Atlantic Ocean. The digital map on Victoria's screen showed them halfway between Newfoundland and the coast of Ireland. For an hour, there was nothing but peace. The rhythmic breathing of sleeping passengers, the turning of pages, the faint clinking of ice in Victoria's glass of sparkling water. She had finally put her iPad away, rubbing her temples, feeling the hollow, isolating reality of her own life. She had $1 billion in the bank, yet sitting next to this exhausted father and his daughter, she felt a strange, inexplicable pang of envy at their bond. Then, the floor dropped out from under them. It didn't start with a shake, it started with a violent, terrifying plunge. The massive Boeing 777 dropped like a stone tossed from a cliff. Passengers who weren't buckled in were thrown against their restraints. A flight attendant in the aisle lost her footing, crashing hard against a bulkhead. Cries of alarm erupted throughout the cabin. Cups, magazines, and Mia's crayons went flying, scattering across the aisles. James woke up instantly, his military reflexes snapping him from deep sleep to high alert in a fraction of a second. His right arm shot out, pinning Mia firmly to her seat. "I've got you, Bug! I've got you!" he shouted over the sudden roar of the wind outside. Victoria gripped her armrests, her knuckles turning bone white, her heart hammering against her ribs. "What is happening?" she gasped, her usual commanding presence entirely shattered by the primal fear of falling. The severe turbulence only lasted for about 20 seconds, but in the air, 20 seconds feels like an eternity. When the aircraft finally caught the air again, slamming the passengers down into their cushions, the cabin was filled with the sound of weeping and frantic whispers. But James wasn't paying attention to the crying passengers. His eyes were wide, staring blankly ahead, his ears tuned to a frequency no one else was listening to. He was listening to the engines. "The pitch is wrong," he thought, his blood turning to ice water. The GE90 engines were throttling back, not slightly, but significantly. And the angle of the aircraft was wrong. They were pitching down. It was a shallow descent, but a descent nonetheless, in the absolute middle of nowhere over the ocean. He looked down the aisle. The purser, a woman with a name tag reading Beatrice, was picking herself up from the floor. She looked disoriented, clutching her shoulder. She grabbed the intercom phone on the wall. James watched her face drain of all color as she listened to whatever was being said on the other end. She dropped the phone and practically sprinted toward the first-class cabin, making a beeline for the reinforced cockpit door. "Daddy, I'm scared," Mia whimpered, burying her face into James's side. "It's just bumpy air, sweetie." Like a roller coaster, James lied smoothly, stroking her hair. But his eyes met Victoria's. The billionaire CEO was looking at him, and she saw through the lie immediately. She saw the absolute, terrifying clarity in his gaze. 5 agonizing minutes passed. The plane continued its gradual descent. The oxygen masks had not deployed, meaning the hull was intact, but something was catastrophically wrong at the front of the plane. Then, a sudden, sharp screech of feedback echoed through the PA system, silencing the entire cabin. It wasn't the smooth, practiced voice of a pilot or a flight attendant. It was a voice tight with panic, breathlessness, and pain. It was the voice of a man who thought he was going to die. "If there is an experienced military combat pilot on this aircraft, ring your call button immediately. Repeat, this is an absolute emergency. We need a combat-rated pilot at the flight deck right now." The intercom clicked off. A heavy, suffocating silence fell over the 300 passengers. Then, absolute pandemonium broke out. People began yelling, praying, and demanding answers. James sat frozen, his heart hammered in his chest, echoing in his ears. Combat pilot. He hadn't sat in the cockpit of a fighter jet since the day he buried his wife. He had traded supersonic speeds for the slow, agonizing pace of grief and fatherhood. He looked down at Mia. She was his entire world. If he stood up, if he walked through that door, he was stepping back into a world of life and death consequences. What if he failed? What if Mia lost her father, too? You. James blinked and looked to his right. Victoria Kensington was staring at him. All of her corporate armor was gone. Her expensive Tom Ford suit looked irrelevant. She wasn't a CEO looking at a peasant. She was a terrified human being looking at her only hope. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at his right shoulder. "You have a patch outline on your jacket," Victoria said, her voice dropping to a fierce, urgent whisper. "You were military, weren't you?" James swallowed hard. He looked at Mia, who was staring up at him with wide, tear-filled eyes. "I was," James said quietly. "Then, they need you," Victoria pleaded. It was the first time in a decade the billionaire had begged anyone for anything. "Please." James closed his eyes for 1 second. He took a deep breath, compartmentalizing the fear, shoving the grief into a box and locking it away. When he opened his eyes, the exhausted, broken single father was gone. The F-22 Raptor pilot had returned. He unbuckled his seatbelt. He turned to Victoria, his gaze so intense and commanding that she physically shrank back into her seat. "Her name is Mia," James said, his voice hard as steel. "You are going to hold her hand. You are going to talk to her. You are not going to let her see you panic. Do you understand me?" Victoria Kensington, a woman who commanded boards of directors and prime ministers, nodded obediently. "I understand." James leaned down and kissed Mia's forehead. "Daddy has to go help the pilots fly the plane, Bug. You stay with this nice lady. I will be right back. I promise." He didn't wait for a response. He reached up and slammed his finger into the call button above his head. The loud ding cut through the noise of the panic. Almost instantly, Beatrice the purser came running down the aisle. She saw James standing up in the aisle, his broad shoulders squared, his posture exuding a terrifying calm. "Are you?" she gasped out of breath. "James Sterling, United States Air Force, 94th Fighter Squadron, F-22, Raptors," James rattled off with clinical precision. "What is the situation?" Beatrice looked like she might burst into tears of relief. "Follow me, now, please." James stepped past Victoria and Mia, giving his daughter one last look before he followed Beatrice through the curtain, past the luxurious first-class pods, and stood before the heavy, reinforced security door of the cockpit. Beatrice punched in a keypad code, the heavy locking mechanism clicked, and the door swung outward. James stepped inside, and the cold reality of the nightmare washed over him. The cockpit was a chaotic symphony of glaring red warning lights and blaring automated alarms pulling his senses in a dozen directions at once. "Terrain, terrain, pull up," the mechanical voice of the onboard computer shouted ruthlessly. But it wasn't the alarms that made James's blood run cold. It was the sight of the two men meant to be flying the plane. The man, whose name tag read Capt. R. Sullivan, was slumped completely forward, his head resting dangerously against the control yoke. A deep, jagged laceration across his forehead poured crimson down his face, a brutal testament to the violent negative G plunge they had just endured. Beside him in the right seat, First Officer Peter Hayes was engaged in a desperate, losing battle. Hayes was young, perhaps in his late 20s, and his face was drained of all color. His hands trembled violently as he gripped his own yoke, his eyes darting frantically across a terrifying display of contradictory information. "Pull him back! Get him off the controls!" James barked over the cacophony of the blaring sync rate. "Pull up alarms." Beatrice, fueled by pure adrenaline, lunged forward. She grabbed the heavy shoulder harnesses of Captain Sullivan and hauled the unconscious man backward, strapping his limp body tightly into the seat so he wouldn't interfere with the instruments. James didn't wait for an invitation. He squeezed past the center console, his eyes sweeping the glass cockpit displays with the rapid, clinical precision of a man who had spent thousands of hours analyzing digital horizons while pulling 9Gs. "Status, First Officer," James shouted, his voice cutting through the panic like a blade. It was the voice of a squadron commander, demanding order from chaos. Hayes flinched, snapping his head toward James. We hit a massive clear-air microburst. The captain smashed his head on the glare shield when we dropped, the autopilot disconnected, and I have unreliable airspeed. The primary displays are disagreeing. The left side says, we're overspeeding. The right side says, we're stalling. The stick shaker activated, so I pushed the nose down to gain speed, but we're still dropping. James recognized the scenario instantly. It was the same catastrophic cascade of sensory failures that had brought down Air France Flight 447 over the Atlantic years ago. The severe weather had likely flash-frozen the pitot tubes, the external sensors that tell the plane how fast it is flying. The aircraft's computers, receiving conflicting data, simply threw their digital hands in the air and quit, handing manual control to a co-pilot who was now experiencing profound spatial disorientation in the pitch-black night. "You're not stalling, you're diving," James yelled. He reached over and grabbed the first officer's yoke. "Let go of the controls, Peter. I have the aircraft." "You can't. You're not rated for a 777. I said, "My aircraft," James roared, a flash of pure command in his eyes that left no room for argument. Hayes released the yoke, throwing his hands up, his chest heaving with panic. James didn't sit in the captain's seat. There was no time to move Sullivan. He stood wedged between the seats, his large hands gripping the dual columns of the yoke. He ignored the screaming alarms. He ignored the flashing red lights. He relied on the one thing a fighter pilot trusts more than a computer: pitch and power. If you set the engine thrust to a specific output and hold the nose of the aircraft at a specific angle, the plane will fly, regardless of what the broken airspeed indicators say. "Give me 85% N1 thrust. Now," James commanded. Hayes, snapping back into his training, reached out and shoved the heavy throttle levers forward. The massive GE90 engines roared in response, vibrating through the floorboards. James planted his boots on the floor and pulled back on the yoke. The Boeing 777 was a colossal, heavy beast, entirely different from the nimble, twitchy F-22 Raptor he used to fly. It felt like trying to steer a skyscraper. His muscles strained against the aerodynamic forces, pushing against the massive control surfaces outside. "Come on, you heavy son of a bitch, fly," James gritted through his teeth. Slowly, agonizingly, the artificial horizon on the central backup display began to level out. The digital altimeter, which had been unwinding like a slot machine, slowed its descent. They had dropped from 35,000 feet to 18,000 feet in less than 3 minutes. As the nose of the massive jet lifted, the brutal forces of physics pushed every passenger in the cabin deep into their seats. Back in row 8, Victoria Kensington gasped as the immense pressure hit her chest. The terrifying sensation of weightlessness vanished, replaced by the heavy, reassuring pull of gravity. She looked down at her hand. Mia's small fingers were completely intertwined with hers, gripping with astonishing strength. "Is my daddy flying the plane?" Mia asked, her voice a small, terrified squeak over the roar of the engines. Victoria swallowed the lump of absolute terror in her throat. She looked at the little girl, remembering the man's final instruction. "You are going to hold her hand. You are not going to let her see you panic." "Yes, Mia," Victoria said, forcing a calm she absolutely did not feel into her voice. She smoothed the little girl's hair with her free hand. "Your daddy is flying the plane. He's making it level again. He's a knight, Mia whispered, squeezing her eyes shut. He told me knights protect people when the dark comes. Victoria felt a sudden, sharp ache in her chest that had nothing to do with the G-force. She had spent her entire life building walls, amassing wealth, and curating an empire where everyone was expendable. Yet, in this moment, a few inches from plunging into the freezing Atlantic, her billions meant absolutely nothing. The only currency that mattered was the courage of a broken man sitting in premium economy and the trust of the little girl beside her. He is a knight, Victoria agreed softly. In the cockpit, the sink rate alarm finally silenced. The altimeter stabilized at 15,000 feet. The aircraft was flying level. Beatrice let out a ragged, sobbing gasp of relief, leaning her forehead against the bulkhead. "Good work, Peter," James said, breathing heavily as he finally allowed his grip on the yoke to loosen a fraction. "Engage the autopilot. Heading select. Keep us straight and level." Hayes pushed the illuminated button on the glare shield. The computers took over the heavy lifting. Autopilot engaged. "We're level at 15,000. James nodded, wiping a sheen of cold sweat from his forehead. He turned to Beatrice. "Get a medical kit. Bandage the captain's head. We need him stabilized. Then, I need you to go back into the cabin. Tell the passengers we hit an air pocket, but everything is under control. Lie if you have to. Keep them calm." "Yes, sir," Beatrice stammered, already moving to unlatch the first aid kit from the wall. James looked out the thick windshield. There was nothing but absolute, terrifying darkness. He turned back to Hayes. The immediate crisis was over, but the adrenaline in his blood was still screaming that something was wrong. A feeling, forged in the skies over hostile territories, gnawed at the back of his mind. "Peter," James said quietly, "check your engine instrument displays." Hayes frowned, wiping his eyes, and looked at the lower center screen. His eyes widened, and all the color drained from his face for a second time. "Oh, God," Hayes whispered. The digital fuel gauges were dropping fast enough to see the numbers ticking downward in real time. "We have a massive discrepancy between the calculated fuel burn and the actual tanks," Hayes said, his fingers flying across the keypad of the flight management computer. "The right wing tank is hemorrhaging Jet A. The turbulence, the sheer force of that drop, it must have fractured a main feed line, or worse, compromised the wing structure itself." James leaned over the console, his mind rapidly calculating time, distance, and weight. "How much time do we have before the right engine starves?" 10 minutes. "Maybe less," Hayes stammered. "And we're losing total system fuel because the crossfeed valve was open. I'm shutting it now, isolating the left tank." "Do it," James commanded. He stared at the navigation display. The glowing green line of their flight path stretched endlessly eastward toward the United Kingdom, surrounded by thousands of miles of black ocean. "We can't make London. We don't have the fuel, and we don't have the altitude. Where are we, exactly?" Hayes zoomed out the navigation map. A small, solitary speck of land appeared far to the south of their current track. "Lodges Field," Hayes pointed to the screen. "Terceira Island, in the Azores. It's a Portuguese and U.S. Air Force joint base. They have a runway long enough for a heavy 777. But what? It's 200 miles away. With our current fuel leak and the drag from whatever structural damage we have on the right wing, it's going to be incredibly tight. And the weather reports there are terrible. Heavy fog, low ceilings, and crosswinds." James stared at the small green dot on the screen. It was their only lifeline. The alternative was ditching a massive, heavily loaded commercial airliner into the freezing swells of the North Atlantic at night, a scenario with an almost 0% survival rate. "Dial in the coordinates for Lodges. Declare an emergency. Mayday, mayday, mayday. Tell them we are a heavy 777, critical fuel leak, one incapacitated pilot, and we are diverting to their runway immediately," James instructed. As Hayes grabbed the radio mic to transmit on the emergency guard frequency, James carefully unbuckled the captain and, with Beatrice's help, finally managed to haul Sullivan out of the left seat. James slid into the command chair. The seat was still warm. The controls felt strange in his hands, but the geometry of flight never changed. He gripped the yoke and clicked the autopilot off. "I have the aircraft," initiating a turn to heading 170. James gently banked the massive airliner to the right. As he did, a violent shudder ripped through the airframe. The yoke kicked back against his hands like a living thing. Bam, bam, bam. A sound like cannon fire echoed outside the starboard window. The master caution alarm illuminated the cockpit in a blinding amber glow. The right engine, starved of fuel, was suffering terrifying compressor stalls, choking on air as the combustion chambers ran dry. "Engine number 2 is failing," Hayes shouted over the noise. "Shut it down! Cut the fuel cutoff switch! Pull the fire handle!" James roared, his arms straining as the aircraft immediately tried to violently yaw to the right due to the asymmetric thrust. When one engine dies, the other engine pushes the plane sideways, a deadly aerodynamic trap that can flip an aircraft on its back if not immediately countered. James slammed his left foot down onto the rudder pedal, physically fighting the massive jet to keep its nose pointed straight ahead. Hayes reached up and yanked the illuminated red fire handle for the right engine, severing all hydraulics, fuel, and electrical power to the massive GE-90 outside. The horrific banging stopped, but the silence that followed was somehow worse. They were now flying on half their power, dragging a dead, windmilling engine through the air, bleeding altitude, and racing a fuel gauge to a tiny strip of asphalt in the middle of the ocean. Back in the cabin, the violent shudder and the sudden change in engine noise had terrified the passengers all over again. The lights flickered. Victoria Kensington felt her heart lodge in her throat. She looked out the window, but there was nothing but a void. She turned her attention back to Mia, who was now quietly crying, clutching her coloring book against her chest. Victoria unbuckled her seatbelt, ignoring the illuminated sign above her. She slid over from her aisle seat, completely bridging the gap between them, and pulled the little girl into her lap. It was an incredibly awkward gesture for a woman who hadn't hugged anyone in years, but desperation strips away pretense. "Hey," Victoria whispered softly, rocking the child. "Hey, look at me." Mia looked up, her blue eyes brimming with tears. "I know it's scary. I'm scared too," Victoria admitted, her voice trembling just a fraction. It was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in a decade. "But your dad is up there, and from what I saw, he's the bravest man I've ever met. Do you think he would let anything happen to you?" Mia sniffled, wiping her nose with the back of her hand. "No, he promised he'd be right back." "Exactly, and knights always keep their promises, don't they?" Mia gave a tiny, hesitant nod. Victoria held the girl tighter, staring at the closed curtains separating the premium cabin from the front. "Please, James," she thought, a desperate, silent prayer to a god she rarely spoke to. "Please get us down." In the cockpit, the situation was degrading by the minute. "Lodge's control tower is on the line," Hayes said, pressing his headset tightly to his ear. "They have us on radar. They've cleared the airspace. But James, the weather." "Give it to me straight," James said, his eyes glued to the artificial horizon, using his left foot to hold constant pressure on the rudder. "Visibility is down to half a mile, ceiling is at 400 feet, wind is gusting at 30 knots across the runway. It's a Category 3 approach, but we don't have the autopilot functioning to do an autoland. And we are coming in way too heavy. A commercial airliner normally dumps fuel before landing in an emergency to reduce weight and landing speed, but they couldn't dump fuel. They were practically out of it. They were going to have to land at maximum gross weight on one engine in near zero visibility, fighting a crosswind. It was an impossible landing, a death sentence by the book. James took a deep, steadying breath. The walls of the cockpit seemed to fall away. The blaring alarms faded into background noise. He was no longer a grieving widower, and he was no longer an exhausted father. He was a weapon, forged in the intense pressure of combat, returning to his element. "Tell Lodge's tower to have the fire trucks waiting," James said, his voice dropping to a terrifying, absolute calm. "We're coming in hot." Through the thick windshield, the first faint, gray light of dawn began to bleed into the horizon, revealing the ominous, swirling mass of storm clouds that swallowed the tiny island below. They were diving straight into it. "Gear down, flaps 30, James commanded, his voice tight with exertion. Hayes shoved the heavy gear lever downward. The Boeing 777 shuddered violently as the massive undercarriage deployed into the howling slipstream, acting like a giant, unyielding air brake. "Gear is down and locked." "3 green, Hayes confirmed, his breath hitching. "We are 2 miles out, approaching decision height. I still don't have the runway, James. The fog is too thick." Rain hammered against the thick acrylic of the windshield in horizontal sheets. The wipers slashed back and forth at their maximum speed, completely overwhelmed by the torrential Atlantic storm. Inside the flight deck, the automated voice of the ground proximity warning system began its sterile, terrifying countdown. 500. "Keep your eyes outside, Peter. Call it the second you see the approach lights," James said. His left leg was trembling from the sheer physical effort of holding the rudder pedal down to counter the drag of the dead starboard engine. He was flying by the seat of his pants, relying on raw muscle memory and the faint green crosshairs of the instrument landing display. 400. Because of their immense weight, their approach speed was dangerously fast, nearly 180 knots. To make matters worse, a brutal 30-knot crosswind was blowing from the north, trying to push the colossal aircraft sideways off the invisible glide path. James had to heavily crab the airplane, pointing the nose of the jet diagonally into the wind, just to keep it tracking straight toward the unseen island. 300. In the premium economy cabin, the violent turbulence was tearing through the passengers' last shreds of composure. Oxygen masks rattled in their overhead compartments. The heavy jet swung sickeningly from side to side. Victoria Kensington squeezed her eyes shut. She had Mia practically entirely enveloped in her arms, shielding the little girl's head against her chest. Victoria's impeccably styled hair was a mess. Her expensive jacket was wrinkled and stained with spilled water from the earlier plunge. She didn't care. For the first time in her rigidly controlled life, Victoria wasn't calculating profit margins or market shares. She was praying. She was holding on to this child like an anchor in a raging sea, realizing that all her money, all her influence, and all her power ended at the cabin door. "Hold on, Mia," Victoria whispered into the girl's ear over the roar of the wind. "Hold on tight." 200. "Minimums," Hayes shouted, gripping the armrests of his seat. "James, we're at minimums. I don't see." "There," James interrupted, his eyes catching a faint, blurry halo of high-intensity strobe lights bleeding through the gray soup. Suddenly, the clouds tore open. The wet, black asphalt of Lodge's field materialized out of the fog, rushing up to meet them at a terrifying speed. They were misaligned, drifting dangerously close to the left edge of the runway. "I have the runway," James barked. 100. James didn't hesitate. He forcefully kicked the right rudder pedal, bringing the nose of the heavy jet parallel with the center line, simultaneously banking the wings into the wind to stop the drift. It was a violent, complex maneuver known as a slip, incredibly difficult in a fighter jet, let alone a crippled, overweight, wide-body airliner. 50, 40, 30. "Pulling power," James announced, yanking the single working throttle back to idle. 20, 10. James hauled back on the yoke, flaring the massive nose. The main landing gear slammed into the Portuguese concrete with a bone-jarring impact. The entire fuselage groaned under the immense stress of the overweight landing. Overhead bins popped open, spilling luggage into the aisles. Passengers screamed, but the tires held. Thrust reverser deployed. Speed brakes up, Hayes yelled, his hands flying across the center console. Without the right engine to provide reverse thrust, the aircraft violently jerked to the left, threatening to skid entirely off the wet runway into the muddy grass. James stomped on the right brake pedal, fighting the asymmetric deceleration with everything he had left. The heavy anti-lock brakes screamed, glowing cherry red as they fought to dissipate the kinetic energy of a massive machine moving at 150 miles an hour. The smell of burning rubber and scorched carbon instantly filled the cabin air conditioning system. "Come on, stop. James gritted his teeth, his arms locking out as he wrestled the yoke. The runway end lights were rushing toward them, a string of red dots signaling the edge of a steep cliff that dropped off into the Atlantic. Slower. The howling wind outside began to overpower the roar of the single engine. The violent shaking subsided into a heavy, rolling rumble. With less than 500 feet of runway remaining, the massive Boeing 777 finally groaned, shuddered, and came to a complete, glorious halt. Silence crashed down on the cockpit. Outside, the flashing red and blue lights of Portuguese emergency vehicles immediately pierced the gloom, swarming the aircraft from all sides. James sat frozen in the left seat. His chest heaved, his hands were locked into claw-like grips on the yoke, his knuckles entirely white. It took him several seconds to realize the aircraft was no longer moving. Beside him, First Officer Peter Hayes ripped his headset off and buried his face in his trembling hands, letting out a ragged, echoing sob of pure relief. Beatrice burst through the reinforced door, tears streaming down her face, and threw her arms around Hayes's shoulders. James slowly uncurled his fingers. He reached over, completed the engine shutdown checklist, and killed the remaining battery power. The screens went dark. He unbuckled his harness. His legs felt like lead, his entire body drained of adrenaline, leaving only a bone-deep exhaustion. But he had one more mission. He pushed past Beatrice and Hayes, stepping out of the flight deck and into the dim, chaotic cabin. The passengers were cheering. Some were weeping, others were hugging strangers, but James didn't look at them. He pushed his way down the aisle, his eyes scanning the premium economy section, until he found row 8. Victoria Kensington was sitting in the aisle seat. She looked up as James approached. The ruthless, untouchable billionaire was gone. In her place was a woman who had just stared death in the face and survived. Curled securely in her lap, clutching her faded red crayon, was Mia. "Daddy!" Mia scrambled out of Victoria's arms and launched herself into the aisle. James dropped to his knees, not caring about the hard floor, and caught his daughter in a crushing embrace. He buried his face in her shoulder, the stoic armor of the fighter pilot finally fracturing as he breathed in the scent of her hair. "I've got you, bug," James choked out, tears finally spilling over his eyelashes. "I'm right here. I promised." Victoria slowly stood up. She watched the broken man and his daughter, feeling a profound, fundamental shift within her own chest. She stepped forward and gently placed a manicured, trembling hand on James's leather-clad shoulder. James looked up at her, wiping his face. "Thank you," Victoria said. Her voice was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of a life entirely transformed. "You kept your promise." James looked at the woman who had protected his daughter when he couldn't. He nodded slowly. A silent pact formed between two people from entirely different worlds, bound together by the terrifying gravity of the sky. Weeks later, the tarmac was quiet. James stood by the newly purchased Cessna, a small smile playing on his lips as Mia ran around the landing gear. Victoria stood beside him, trading her Tom Ford suits for a leather jacket. They had survived the sky, but more importantly, they had saved each other on the ground. Some flights take you to a destination, others bring you home.